So we're here just to talk about some of the things that women in our community and our country and beyond our borders are talking about right now. And this sort of comes from a conversation that I had with you, Lenore, recently. We were on the phone talking about some work stuff, and it was the day that the verdict came down on the Bill Cosby trial, and that got us talking about that. And from there, we went on and on and on for probably an hour, because one thing led to another, and it made me realize that women all over our community are having really important conversations about what it is to be a woman, the role of women in our society right now, and I think, we talked about fear. We talked about, in some ways it seems like a scary time to be a woman in some regards. So maybe, Lenore, we can start with you.
Yeah, and I'll jump in too to say that I think that was also around when the van incident happened in Toronto, where now we can say with some confirmation that women were targeted in that attack and killed, and that the whole concept of incel came up, the involuntary celibate movement, and other assorted misogynist hate groups, and that for me it's about living in this time where this hopeful moment of Me Too, where there's space for some survivors, and I really want to stress that, because most survivors we're still working with can't come forward and can't talk about with the same support publicly, even from their family or friends. So there's this weird mix of this hopeful time, and then also women getting targeted, and in the Twitterverse, getting hate and trolling that happens constantly if you're talking about these issues. So it feels like a pretty confusing and exhausting time. So we're happy about the Bill Cosby verdict, but it took 60 survivors in that one case, who came forward. There may be others, but so it was like 60 women, and then he got that verdict, but how many other men are off the hook?
Well, it was 60 women, but there were 2 court trials,
yes.
Right? So
yeah.
Having to go through that intensive process for those women who did bring charges forward originally, or were supported in having charges brought forward originally, to have those dismissed, and then to get to that point when the Cosby verdict came out this time, I had a sense of elation and vindication. There was
were you surprised, Medora?
I was surprised. I was shocked, because
I
I don't believe. Regardless of the Me Too movement and all the discussion, the Women's March, everything that we're talking about, I still don't believe that the justice system has significantly changed. So it was a surprise that, because we don't often see these kinds of verdicts, and there's so few sexual assault cases that actually end up in trial anyways, and we know the statistics doing this work for a long time. So I was shocked. And he's still seen and revered as a hero and innocent by many people. Yeah. But it felt great for me, and I was with my family at the time, and I shared my how excited I was, and my daughter said, "Well, what did you have to do with it?" And I said, "You know what? I stood outside of Hamilton Place.
It was minus 20 that day.
And minus 20, I came home. I was wearing snow pants and the warmest boots and the warmest coat as we protested for we were out there for 3 or 4 hours when he was inside, trying to make people laugh. It was a horrifying thing, and I got home with my thighs frozen, like I had the burns, and it just spoke to me. I remember that protest. I remember how involved we were, how committed we were, and but those kinds, when those verdicts happen, it tells us that we are moving forward. We do have the potential to make change, and something has to give in this system. But I was shocked by the outcome.
What about you, Laura?
I was really surprised too. I really sincerely was surprised. My reaction was,
oh, wow, okay. Like, because I didn't anticipate that outcome.
Why?
Because of everything that Medora was saying, just that, sense of like, okay, well, the justice system just isn't up to par, and, history has shown us time and again, and it has disappointed us time and again, and, maybe sort of indirectly related, I've seen the justice system fail people incredibly over the course of my own career in my own lifetime. So I just didn't really have much hope. So yeah, I was very surprised.
What about you, Jyssika?
Similar. Yeah, surprised.
Where were you when you found out about the verdict?
I mean, I tend to not locate myself. I could probably check my phone though. I know they track those things.
You're wandering.
Yeah.
I just wondered if it was that kind of a moment for you that you that it was such a big thing that you remembered where you were and you remembered when you got the news.
I think I don't have the same, and this isn't an age thing to my maybe colleagues here, but I haven't been necessarily struggling or fighting for quite as long. So I feel like, and I also missed the Cosby Show a little bit, like just in terms of an age,
Right,
an age gap. But I do think that I would say a similar feeling kind of came when the stuff with Headley came out.
Yeah.
Now that hasn't been tried in a court, but I think there are a lot of young people that are when our Canadian celebrities and those that our young people look up to. I think that maybe is more of a relevant, impactful moment for myself, seeing the lead singer taken down after that.
And it was interesting because at that moment, like both for the Cosby and the Headley, I remember getting quite a lot of angry Headley fans about stuff that I was tweeting, and a lot of them identifying as survivors, and that really complicated. Not a lot of them. Some of them identifying as survivors, and that complicated space of them saying, well, he speaks, there's a great band, and us still, standing by our position that we believe survivors, and that this is something that we have to take seriously. And I know I was struggling because the Women Abuse Working Group, we did a protest for Cosby, and we should have done a protest for Headley. We were just also burnt out. I mean, that's the honest truth, because, and I was asked that question, like, when's the Headley protest coming? Because they also played in our community after this broke, but it was literally this story about the lead singer broke, and a week and a half later they were coming to our community, whereas with Cosby, I think we had a few months notice. Medora, I'm looking at you, and so we could pull it together, and I think that also spoke to me about this feeling of exhaustion, that almost like, well, I think every day there is some story or some issue or some like Me Too thing or other injustice that we should be doing something about, and the level of dialogue I found has never been so vigorous. And so I feel like I literally was so upset because, it was really a hard decision for us to protest Bill Cosby as a black man. And particularly back then when it wasn't quite so clear all the details of the case, although we were very confident in protesting, and then to not protest a white Canadian, white-skinned Canadian band. And it was like, yeah, we have to be really careful around that, because the racism that's so out there, and who we believe are more likely to be rapists, and who we believe are more likely to be caught up in harassment and of various forms. So, but the honest truth was that we were just exhausted, and we didn't protest.
But I think you've hit on a good point. I mean, have we reached or might we reach a level of saturation where we start to not pay attention again, because it is happening every day? I mean, perhaps it slowed down a little bit, but there was a while there where some Hollywood star, some producer, some music hero was caught up in allegations every day. And are we tuning that out now, or does it matter the same way it mattered 6 months ago?
I still think there's call-outs, but it's moving beyond just the high-profile media people, and still into, high-profile, not the Hollywood people, but the
Yeah.
politicians, or heads of companies or leaders in companies, right? So I think that there's still a desire and intent for women to calling out the abuse, harassment that they've faced, who, like Lenore said earlier, have that safety and maybe can find some safety and can find some network and support to do that. I'm so glad, Lenore, you brought up the issue, though, of race in terms of how complicated that was with Cosby,
Yeah.
because at the same time when I said I was so surprised about the verdict, the fact that he's a black man, it doesn't surprise me, right, that black men are accused and found guilty. But I do believe that he was a sexual
Predator.
Yeah, very much. And I think that we need to keep that in mind, because we're sitting around with, we may be racialized, but we have white skin privilege in this room, and we're talking about a black man started the conversation about a black man who's being accused.
Yeah.
But I think it also connects to this racism and hostility connected to the van incident in Toronto, those murders. Immediately, it went to, this guy must be a terrorist,
Yes.
kind of loosely talking about maybe he's from the Middle East, and therefore linking it to a terrorism activity, because that's where people's heads go. We link to how we connect race to male violence, and don't understand that male violence against women is happening often and frequently by white men.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would absolutely call that incident terrorism, what happened. But how we define terrorism is also, I think, complicated. And for me, I think, Susan, one of the things that you and I were initially, I was getting frustrated about is that there were some opinion columns coming out about how people shouldn't be using this van incident, the people being killed in Toronto, as a platform, quote unquote. And I was so frustrated, like, why is talking about violence against women make you on a platform when it is such an everyday common experience, all the forms, domestic violence, sexual violence, women being targeted in the street harassment, these kinds of larger scale violent episodes. I mean, there are, for me to have to keep saying these are connected, that women's place, that the violence against women is not a sort of, I'm on a platform or a special issues that I'm using. That's what this was about. And I think for me, the frustration of it always having to explain and keep explaining, like, this is connected, and this is connected when women get killed by their partner who's supposed to love them, and when women get raped on campus, and that these are all, parts of the same spectrum of violence against women.
And so what you're saying, I think, Lenore, is that it wasn't a stretch to talk about the van incident in Toronto in the same sentence as misogyny and as violence against women and as all these things, whereas some commentators were saying there's no need to go there. There's no connection.
Yes.
You're saying that there absolutely is.
Yes. Laura's making a face. I think you have to say something, Laura.
Go ahead, Laura.
I think it's absurd to suggest that we're taking some sort of platform when he absolutely took a platform by plowing into people and killing them for a specific reason.
Yeah.
Right.
And connecting a movement that he was speaking on behalf of just by his actions. So
Is that the incel movement?
Right.
How many of you had heard of incel before that?
Yeah.
You all had?
We all
Okay,
had.
so I'm the only
Heads
one who,
shaking.
and I'll be honest, I had never heard of it until this happened. And, I think I said that to you, Lenore, so I had to do a deep dive and educate myself and learn about it. And it's horrifying.
Yeah.
It's all, it's just so out there that at first I had to decide if this was real or not. Like this is a real thing.
Yeah.
And once I got past that, then I was, horrified.
Yeah.
So
It's a real thing that's been happening for a long time.
Yeah.
Like this has, I think that when we talk about terrorism, we talk about being radicalized. These like young people, young men of all races are being radicalized online. White men are being radicalized online in communities, specifically around their misogyny, especially, right? Like this, the origins of this movement can be traced all the way back, well, not all the way back, but back to Gamergate, back to pickup artists, centering around women having the right to say, no, I'm not going to sleep with you, and having the right to say no with their own bodies. And it's not a surprise, you know, there's been so many, being a woman on the internet, and being a young person on the internet, whether or not you're in public or if you're anonymous, there's a tone, and not just a tone against women, but also a tone against women standing for their rights. The term social justice warrior, which is used to take down women, people of color, trans folks, non-binary folks. That term is used to discredit people constantly on the internet. You're just taking that platform, like Laura was saying, you're taking that, you're trying to make a grandstand. When it's people advocating for inclusion, for their rights, for their safety, our issues compared to the issues of the perceived issues of the incel movement, their issues are that women have not volunteered to sleep with them. Our issues are, we're worried about our lives, we're worried about our safety, we're worried about our economic safety. It's just on a different level.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we take that conversation now, about is this a good thing that we're now talking about incel, and that people like me who had never heard of it before are now aware of it? Are we sort of, you know, shining a light on something that's been hidden away, or are we, you know, I think there are some who argue that this is such a fringe group and such a minority of people that it's not even worth talking about. What do you think, Medora? Your eyebrows are furrowed.
I think there's a lot of parents out there who would be surprised that their sons are participating in this kind of thinking and would be woken up. And like you said, Susan, you didn't know about it. I only knew about it from my 16-year-old daughter, who had been talking to me about it for the last year. So as soon as the connection, at 16.
That makes me sad.
So she was quite aware of the dialogue that was going on. She was educating me about it, but I kept thinking, like you, is this, like, why are you involved in this? She's not involved. She was paying attention to it.
Like,
she was.
How are you getting access to this
How are
thinking?
you getting access?
Yeah.
And who is this thinking? And this seems very, small and fringe and bizarre. And somebody's just picked up on this and
Medora, I don't want to dive too deeply into your daughter's life, but is this something that she's aware of because she's sort of watching it from afar online, or is it something that's actually affecting her social group?
So it's something that she's watching from afar online and making fun of, and it does affect her social group, and that kind of thinking has affected her online. She's been dealing with online, being targeted online since she entered the online world when she was 12 or 13. So so there are all sorts of pieces of information that she's gathering and aware of, that I realized the extent of the reality of this kind of thinking because of the incident in Toronto. And I think we do. I think there's a lot of us who need to be woken up to what's actually taking place online. For Lenore and I, in our history, dealing with misogyny groups and hate groups, it has not been in an online forum. It's been posters going up, real and live, in our faces, or posters being put up, or men's rights groups hanging out at the family courthouse trying to prevent women from having voice there, in these other kinds of ways. So
at the
this
Cosby
the
protest,
Cosby
they
protest,
were there yelling
the
at us.
the anti-women group across yelling at us. Yeah, that's how we've dealt with it, but not in this online forum, which is vast, it's wider, faster,
And I think
stronger.
quite scary, quite scary. I mean, it's scary when they're yelling at you across the street too, and I think for me, I really wanted to jump in about this idea that they're fringe, because we're also living in this moment where, and I don't want to have to say his name, but I will, there's a lot of permissiveness because of what President Trump, in terms of white nationalism and the level of racist commentary that's deemed normal now, or like, so you have like the Proud Boys and all these offshoot groups, and there's some really good work that's being written that there's a real link between these white supremacist groups and men's hate groups, like the misogynist hate groups, that these are radicalizing men in similar ways, and that there's cross connection in these groups. And so while I'm going to remain hopeful that the actual folks who are really in that incel thinking might be a smaller number, it's growing. And I think it's the ideology, there's almost like you're allowed to say certain stuff that you couldn't say a few years ago.
It's like the Trump effect.
Yes, it's the Trump effect. And that we are living in that time where people think like it's cool to be against political correctness, like somehow political correctness is freedom bashing and like rights limiting, and that you're allowed to say that you don't want to use someone's correct pronouns, and that you're a superstar, and that you're allowed to question immigration policies, and you're allowed to be anti-Muslim and and say that violence against women is made up, and like you're allowed to say that stuff now in a really different way.
That it's just being provocative.
Yeah.
It's and that's cool.
Yeah, it's
right?
very cool.
Yeah.
And so how I know that we're making any ground is because we're getting backlash. Like that's how I know stuff's working, because it's turning up the backlash meter. That just makes it very hard though, because I think for individuals and activists and organizations, you just get exhausted having to constantly say this is real, or I don't want to have to keep, it's been 25 years, I don't want to have to keep convincing you that rape exists, that violence against women exists, that transphobia is constant, that even though we're in truth and reconciliation moments, the kind of hate and racism that happens to Indigenous folks is steady. So I think it's a strange paradox when we're living in this time, I would say.
Well, and I can't help but think, that is exhausting, right? I mean, just listening to you give us that laundry list of things that haven't seemed to change very much. And when the van attack happened in Toronto, that day when I heard the news about it, it took me right back to when I was in my 4th year of university and École Polytechnique happened, which, we all have our different markers in our lives that had, those kinds of profound effects on us. And that was the one for me, because I was the same age as those students. I was studying for my exams, and it really brought me back to that and thinking, well, what's changed? Has anything changed? Yeah. Have we made progress? Yeah. And I don't know. What do you think, Laura? Have we made progress from that time back in 1992, 1991, maybe somewhere in there?
So, I mean, I'd like to think that the progress that we've made is just that it's out in the open more, and that these discussions are happening. In terms of actual change, I don't think that's really necessarily happening, because I don't feel any safer on the streets now than I did when I was 13 years old. So, no, I don't think there has been much change, but at least the conversation is out in the open.
Is it a productive conversation, though? I feel sometimes like there's just so much yelling. I can't hear anything anymore.
It's me.
Yeah, there has to be.
That's Lenore doing the yelling. Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah, and that has to be the case, because, I mean, there's been so much silence for so long, and when you're still having that opposition voice saying, that's not a thing, you have to find either volume in numbers or volume in tone, and that's just
good point.
how it has to be.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way to get around that. We can't be speaking nicely about these things when there's nothing nice about it. So
I've been doing anti-racism, anti-oppression training with the staff at the YWCA, training them for 4 years or 5 years now. And it's interesting how the dialogue has changed over time, where the focus of education needs to happen is different. In the most recent session I did, the staff said, some staff said, there was the awful incident with the Humboldt, what happened to the hockey team,
Yep.
and how terrible and tragic that was, and no one dismissed that. But what I heard in that space too was they were saying, as tragic and horrible that was, they couldn't help but think about all the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Over 6,000 now missing and murdered Indigenous women, who we don't have the same level of outrage and disgust and coming together. There isn't the fundraising going on. If we could fundraise the way we did for Humboldt for Indigenous women, it would make such a difference. And I think that if we keep talking about these issues, people are paying attention and will want to see change and will be motivated for change. And how that translates into a backlash scenario, I think, is a very big risk, and it will, and the impact of that backlash will be demonstrated in the form of who we elect.
Yeah,
And
good point.
So
Yeah.
we're in a provincial election now, and if the backlash is really strong enough and we don't fight hard enough against it, then our election outcomes will demonstrate that the strength of the backlash, and it will undermine our work that we've been doing over these last years. But we have the opportunity, if we're raising the issues, that people are paying attention who we didn't think were paying attention before. And that's why, so that anti-racism or anti-oppression training always teaches me year after year, where
Yeah.
people's thinking are moving and shifting.
How do we have these conversations with the young people in our lives? And I'm thinking again, Medora, you mentioned your daughter. So, and I have 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl. And, when we're talking about, let's talk about Me Too for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finding it a real challenge to talk about some of these issues, and to talk to my daughter in a way that reflects what I want to say to my son as well. And I feel like everything's shifting so quickly that sometimes I'm left not quite knowing how to frame things.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to have those open conversations, but sometimes I'm not even sure what I want to say anymore. So, how do we navigate all of that stuff?
I feel like one thing is that there are youth talking about this. There are young people being loud.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Even today, I dropped by Louder Than a Bomb Canada's Youth Poetry Festival. And
They're doing great work.
And I've been on the planning committee for the past year, and the amount of kids, and I mean like middle schoolers, talking even about their experiences of sexual violence, talking about their experiences of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, talking about their experiences in relationships and how they connect to the world. I'm constantly surprised, and I shouldn't be. I'm constantly, young people are constantly exceeding my expectations as a fellow young person in my work. And I think that having young people the opportunity to listen to each other and giving them space to talk to each other and giving them space to raise their voice is key. Because that's the way that we're actually going to be able to make a change in each other's lives as young people.
I feel like as a parent that in many ways, I'm learning more from my kids than they are from me right now. And I mean that in a really good way. We have these interesting, thoughtful conversations where I'm getting this glimpse at a world that I don't live in, right? That my kids do, and I love that, and I love learning from them. It's still, as a parent, I want to have control over it all, and it's making me feel a bit lost sometimes. But I like the idea of giving them the space to have their own conversations.
And I also think too, I have a 9 and a 13-year-old, both boys. And you also have a 13-year-old, eh?
14 now,
Oh my
yeah,
gosh,
yeah.
our kids used to go to school together. So
Yeah.
Laura and my kids. So I know for me, because I've worked at Sexual Assault Center as long as my kids have been around, and they have to have some notion of where mom works. So for me, it's always been a way, age appropriately, of course, to talk about the kind of work mommy does. And they know mommy has to take the support line sometimes in the middle of the night, or mommy might have to go to the hospital with someone. And I've had to find a way to talk with them, and mommy also has the radio on and has the newspaper out, and they read it too. And so I think kids are so curious and they want to understand. And I will never forget, I went to their grade 5 class once, and we talked about gender and gender identity and gender stereotypes and expression. And it was such an amazing and beautiful reminder that they want to talk about this way tons. Like, it was the most enlightened, lively class that I remember going to, and they were all just wanted to keep talking about the way society expects them to act, how it is they're defined, and their orientation, and what it means to be a man and a woman, or nothing or neither. Like, it was beautiful. And I think, we need to give kids space to talk about this. They want to talk about the world, and they want to talk about violence and abuse, not in a way that's like Hollywood sensationalized, but that's actually like, what is it, and what do I do when this is happening? And because I always go back to, the heaviest the users of porn are 12 to 17-year-old boys.
Mm-hmm.
And as a mom with a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old boy, I have to constantly be aware of horrible stuff they could be exposed to, and need to help them navigate healthy sexuality and consent and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's the constant right now, and my son is really actively into gaming culture, right? So my work is cut out for me, man. Every single day I'm having conversations about these types of things, and he's on Instagram and right into meme culture, and so I'm constantly having these conversations around, and it started when he was really young, having these conversations, because again, I have worked in my career in violence against women, and moving into working with youth, I do have to have these constant conversations with other kids as well. So and I think what's really helpful, at least in dealing with my own son and with the kids I work with, is putting youth in front of other youth. I point out what other youth are saying, because it's all well and good coming from me, coming from other adults, but they listen to their peers more than anyone, right? So I'm constantly scouting out, other youth who are saying really amazing things and doing really amazing things, and I just point them in those directions. And it really doesn't take long, because kids tend to be very insular, they sort of create their own bubbles, but it doesn't take much to expand that bubble, so it's just a matter of keeping your eyes open and listening to the young people and listening to what they're saying. And
Are you hopeful for we seem like we're in a bit of a dark place right now because of all of the issues that we've just talked about, and the idea of sort of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Are you hopeful?
I am hopeful, because I think at least with that whole idea of exposure, and the more young people are exposed to really good ideas that are freeing and liberating, and seeing themselves reflected and also seeing other people reflected and getting them to think about how they perceive others. I think that's a really good thing. That's happening more now than even when I was young. And so even like when I think about my exposure on the internet, like I was like first wave generation internet kid, right? And so now this is the second generation. And so each generation just gets, you know, more and more access to information and access to resources. And I think especially when we're dealing with, you know, topics like misogyny and toxic masculinity, there's lots more happening. Those voices are expanding, and the more young men get exposed to these voices and share these ideas, the better, right? Because while there might be a bit of a disconnect between previous generations, because let's face it, not everybody in my generation is good at unpacking this stuff, but it is definitely with the young people that it lies, and so I do have a little more hope. They bring me hope, and every once in a while I hear one of these young guys say something amazing, and it just makes me go, okay, I think I can sleep tonight. Just one night. But, yeah.
What about you, Medora? The same question. Are you hopeful?
Well, I've always been hopeful. I wouldn't have done the work I've been doing for as long as I have if I wasn't. But I am sometimes tired, and I do think that there are other more relevant voices than mine to be listening to. I think particularly youth voices are important, and we've been talking about that. I think that voices of Black youth and queer youth and Indigenous youth are really important. I also think that I don't have, you know, my generation doesn't carry it all. The generation before me isn't responsible for all this work. We sort of collectively share responsibility, so we also have to collectively share space and rely on each other and support each other. So one of the things I try to do is find ways to support and support the voice of young activists seeking social justice, and making sure that they're being heard. And in part, it's also selfish of me, because I know my kids aren't going to listen to me. They're going to, like you said,
We have
right?
a theme
Yeah.
here. Yes.
They're going to listen to people they can relate to, and their mom isn't always the person they relate best to.
Good point. Jyssika, same question for you. Hope for the future? Are you hopeful?
I think, like Medora said, you have to be hopeful to do it. I think that in the work that I do and have been doing with queer and trans youth is that we've had a bit of a moment ourselves in that movement where when I came out, we were talking about suicide and bullying, and we're still talking about that, but we're also seeing so many kids and so many young people push forward, talking about self-advocating in ways that are pushing forward for the youth that are coming. Like I see young people trying to make the world a better place for people just a couple years younger than them, right? Like young people starting positive space groups, young people saying, I want to make sure that other young people can get involved and can vote and can be involved that way. So that being said, I think that I'm always afraid of complacency in the work that I think all of us do. And I think, not to take away from your question, but I think an important part of this conversation is about the myth of Canadian exceptionalism, and that we feel like, well, we've had same-sex marriage since 2005. We're totally fine on racism. Starbucks can train the people in the States, but Canada, we're fine. Like this notion of the fact that we're better, but we're having an impact in this movement, and we have a dialogue in this movement on both sides. We have the Jordan Petersons, we have the Anita Sarkeesians, we have all of these people. Canada is very much a part of this conversation, and we can't be complacent. And We need to continually remind people, like Lenore was saying, that these are still issues. These are the consequences of those issues, and they go beyond being uncomfortable. They go beyond, just our feelings. They go to our safety, and they go to our well-being and to our participation in our collective society, and including online, and including that participation online, and being able to access new frontiers.
I like what you said right there, because it fits in so well with one of the things we started with. You said it goes beyond our feelings, it goes to our safety.
Mm-hmm.
And Lenore, when you talked about certain columnists and commentary around what happened in Toronto with the van, this isn't just about our feelings. This is about our safety. This is about lives.
Yeah, this is about life and death. This is about women continuously being killed, in our communities being raped. And I know those are really hard things to think about. Like, I sound like I'm being an alarmist, but I'm not. Like, that's the truth. And I think for me, it's like, what I love about the internet is that we have so many more voices. But that doesn't mean everyone has a lot of knowledge in the same level. And so, so people can put out opinions and sound like they know what they're talking about, but it can be really dismissive and not helpful dialogue. And so, and that can also happen in newspapers. So I think for me, it is beyond about, this is something I like or dislike, or I agree or disagree with. But if people are dying and it's not touching you, I think you have to question do you need to be commenting on this kind of thing at this point? Because let's listen to the folks who this is affecting, and that's always important for me. And so I agree with what folks have said, that you really have to, what are women saying? What are young people saying? What are they, how are they talking about this? And they are talking about this, absolutely. And that's the one thing that makes me have hope, if we can keep that theme going, is that 2-3 years ago, I would never be able to talk about the term rape culture. And have anyone really kind of get what that is, or they'd be yelling at me or calling me some sort of name because I was trying to talk about that notion. Whereas, there are still people that question that reality, but it's much more mainstream now that we can have conversations about the way that our everyday lives supports women's experiences of sexual violence in its various forms. And so I'm excited that the water cooler level, coffee shop level of dialogue that is happening out there. I'm also exhausted because it just means that every time I go get a coffee, someone wants to have a conversation about, whatever new Me Too thing is happening. So I'm glad about that, but I think it's just, I want to have more dialogue about it, and just some time to rest too.
Isn't it interesting that the van attack, or the van, what happened in Toronto, we don't even have a name for it.
I thought about that.
Yeah.
There will be.
There
I'm
will
sure
be.
at some
Yeah.
point there will be
Yeah.
a name for
Yeah, I know. I
that.
thought about that when I kept saying it's the van attack. I know.
Yeah,
I don't want to say his name. I don't want to say his name. I don't need to say his
we
name.
don't need to validate
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
But much like the Montreal massacre, it's there eventually became a name, and we haven't figured it out because I think we haven't had enough conversations about the fact that he specifically directly targeted women. He had a plan to murder en masse women.
I think that it will be a while before that's generally accepted as there's still let's wait and see.
Yeah.
It probably isn't. It's funny how we are so quick to point fingers at some motives, but
And
not
not
at
others.
others,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and there's the mental health component as well as the component around his where he sat on the autism spectrum as well, which has come up in some other with some of the shooting violence in the States. This has been some of the dialogue, is that it's all these other things and not about male violence or racialized violence. It's all something else that then we can fix with treatment and pills.
Yeah.
I
And
would-
that's
I
we all
would
want to
say
jump
though-
and go.
I would say though, at the same time, is that's how these groups are recruiting, right? Is around mental health. We were talking before we came today about another group in the manosphere that is rather, instead of involuntarily celibate, are sort of celibate by choice, being the men going their own way, the MGTOWs. And it's under a guise of, you know, doing your own thing, you know, doing things that are taking care of yourself, not worrying about those things, or even in pickup artist culture, in the red pill culture, and with Jordan Peterson as well, there's a self-help aspect that is about bettering yourself to then attract a mate, or bettering yourself in a certain way, but then it shifts to being from this self-help notion from when you get into being about, well, help yourself, but then also women,
Blame women for your trouble.
that's
Exactly.
the
constant
So,
dialogue.
and letting and releasing and transforming those emotions into anger, which are then acted out upon.
I think we're going to be wrapping up
Yeah.
shortly.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that anybody wants to add at all? Final thoughts, maybe, Laura?
I think I just really liked what Jess was saying about how everything is interconnected, right? And that's just how I see things. And so for me, just at least where I sit, working first in the education system and second, you know, in Indigenous communities, I can't help but think all of this is interconnected, and it directly affects my community of Indigenous people and queer people. So it's all very intersectional, and so when we're dealing with, you know, when we're dealing with misogyny, I'm thinking about how the many layers of misogyny that there is, and how it all trickles down to Indigenous women and Indigenous queer people too. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think I have so many more thoughts that I could sort of.
We'll have to do a
elaborate
part,
on.
No
I
way.
feel
a
like I
part
could
two.
do like a totally.
I know it's
Medora, any final thoughts from you?
I hope we don't get exhausted talking about it. That I hope that the dialogue that takes place in media and other social forums becomes more complex and more layered, and creates new perspective. It helps shape new perspectives for people and information and insight, and isn't just staying on a superficial level. I found that a lot of it has gone a little deeper. But I think that if we stay really superficial, people will get really tired and not want to hear about all the violence and the extent of it.
How about you, Jyssika? Final thoughts?
Definitely what Laura was saying. It's all connected. We're all connected, especially considering that I think a lot of this also stems on talking about the internet, even more so we're all connected. But I'm having these thoughts while you were mentioning that I've been watching the recent season of The Handmaid's Tale, and you were mentioning that it was filmed here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of all these things and all of these worries and these sort of like signals of things to come, and I'm thinking about all the places where that's already happening. I'm thinking about the people that I support and I work with that have faced the same things that I'm seeing in these films and in these warnings. I think, like I said, I think my main goal is to fight against complacency and keep pushing us forward.
Lenore,
Yeah.
final thoughts?
I'm really excited we had a chance to chat today, because these are really complicated concepts, I think, to communicate in a soundbite. And from someone who does a lot of the media in the organization I work with, I'm always trying to figure out how to talk about the latest sort of Me Too situation in a way that might help readers get it. But it's so hard, because what we were talking about today is the sort of interconnectedness of the way misogyny is supported by racism, is supported by colonialism, by transphobia. And that is like mind-blowing for a lot of people, and it sounds just like a lot of gobbledygook. And so it's nice to take a minute to try to unpack it a little bit for listeners, and that hopefully give folks a chance to think about things in a slightly more complex way than the sort of way that it can sometimes get presented. So thank you.
Thank you to all of you for being part of this. It is complicated, and that is exactly why I decided to invite all of you here today because there's so much to be said, there's so much to learn, there's so much to hear, and the idea of unpacking it, just a little bit at a time, right? And we might have to do some more unpacking another day. I'll invite you guys back.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah,
for
that's
the
great,
input.
Susan. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.